Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Shoily Chakraborty and I'm working as a legal intern in LEXIS and Company. My topic for today is Act of God as a defense in law of torts. An act of God is a general defense used in cases of torts when an event over which the defendant has no control occurs and the damage is caused by the forces of nature. In those cases, the defendant will not be liable in law of torts for such inadvertent damage. The definitions of act of God. The act of God defense is based on the tort of law principle that liability must be founded on a fault and that a person cannot be penalized where the fault is that of a vis major, where all precautions were taken and a casualty still occurred. Vis major is defined as a loss that results immediately from a natural cause without the intervention of man and could not have been prevented by the exercise of prudence, diligence, and care. According to Salmond, an act of God includes those acts which a man cannot avoid by taking reasonable care. Such accidents are the results of natural forces and are incoherent with the agency of man. Thus, it is an act which is due to natural causes directly and exclusively without human intervention, that it could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight and pains and care reasonably to have been expected from him, that is, the defendant. According to Lord Mansfield, the act of God is defined as it is something in opposition to the act of man. Elements of act of God. Natural causes. An act of God is an unnatural, unusual, and unintended expression of nature's powers or misfortune or tragedy arising out of inevitable necessity. Fair human foresight and care will not deter an act of God. The consequence of ordinary causes may be foreseen by the exercise of human treatment and prevented. An act of God is so exceptional and incapable of human agency that the repercussions cannot be prevented with fair treatment. In those situations, however, the injured party has no right to compensation. An occurrence not reasonably foreseeable. The central and primary feature of an act of God is the existence of an unforeseeable occurrence. For this purpose, the person that sustained the injuries is entitled to liability if the damage or harm was incurred by a possible accident that should have been avoided. The harm incurred by an accidental and uncontrollable natural disaster, though is not compensable, as the foresight or prudence of man could not have stopped or avoided it. Impossible to prevent by any reasonable defenses, an absence of human agency which caused the alleged injury. This means it's almost impossible to resist. Failure to take the required care consists negligence. The fact that the human factor exerted fair diligence and measures to avert the harm must be shown in an instance where a human factor was involved, even if the harm could not be stopped if the protection of God's act must prevail. Negligence and act of God. An act of God is an accident caused by the working of extraordinary natural forces, whereas negligence is basically the breach of an obligation or a duty or a responsibility to act with care towards something, or it is the failure to act as a reasonable and a prudent person would act under the same or similar circumstances. In both these defenses, the question is whether the risk that this mishap may occur is foreseeable or not, whether both negligence and the act of God have a role to play. The traditional sine qua non, substantial factor, or legal causation tests apply. If the damages suffered are incurred solely due to natural causes without any known fault, there is no liability because of the act of God. Some important legal precedents in this respect. In the case of Nichols versus Marshland, the defendant has a number of lakes on his property that are artificial. Extraordinary rain that had never been seen in living memory forced the banks of the reservoirs to break, and four bridges belonging to the claimant were swept away by the fleeing flood. It was held that an act of God washed the bridges off the complainant and the defendant was not liable. In Ramalingan Narad versus Narayan Reddyar, the complainant booked goods for shipment with the defendant. A gang is stealing the items, the avoidance of which was outside the defendant's jurisdiction. It was held that the act of God should not be told for an incident outside the defendant's influence. It was held that an unruly mob's actions of aggression cannot be called an act of God. Although the act of God defends that a defendant is insulted from the liability for personal injury or property damage caused by natural causes rarely used, it may become more common and general in the future if predictions of disastrous weather conditions caused by global warming prove true. Thank you.